So good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to this panel discussion as part of the reconstituted Blockchain Global Governance Conference. I've got a great panel here. We're going to be talking to you about how we can use blockchain technology and related tech to think about redesigning financial and social systems after the pandemic, the COVID pandemic having framed this conversation. We're looking to discuss how we can maximize social welfare with decentralized technologies. And as I said, I have a great panel here to talk to you from a range of backgrounds and from all over the world. So let's just, first of all, if we can, let's go through a bit of an introduction. Each of you, if you don't mind, I'll call on you just to give me a very brief introduction. We have a lot of folks and not a lot of time, so let's just keep it short. But first of all, Mamoru Fujimoto from SBI Holdings.
Thank you. I'm very happy to join this panel. My name is Mamoru Fujimoto from SBI Holdings. I'm the head of the blockchain of SBI Holdings and leading some the blockchain-related initiative from Japan and try to reach out to other areas of the globe. Thank you.
Thank you, Mamoru. Okay, Joaquin Garcia-Alfaro.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Joaquin Garcia-Alfaro. I'm professor at Institut Mintelecom in France. It's a federation of engineering schools, and I'm basically computer science engineer, and I do research on security and privacy. So basically access control, data privacy management, infrastructure security, and blockchain from the two perspectives. Nice to meet you.
Thank you, Joaquin. Richard Jendell Brown from R3.
Hi, everybody. Richard Brown, Chief Technology Officer at R3. R3 is the software firm behind the open source blockchain platform Corda.
Thank you, Richard. Tatsuya Kurosaka, please, from Keio University.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tatsuya Kurosaka. I am a business consultant working for telco and media industry, and also contributing to the Japanese government in order to design the regulation regarding the data privacy as well. And this time, I'm also helping our government and community together to deploy contact confirmation app called Cocoa. It seemed like a kind of contact tracing app, but we determined to make this app without tracing. In this panel discussion, I would like briefly to introduce this contact confirmation app launched last week, and hope to discuss how we find a practical solution against COVID-19 based on the distributed or decentralized architecture in the context of social systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Tatsuya. Okay, Shinichiro Matsuo from Georgetown.
Hi, so hello everyone. So I'm Shinichiro Matsuo, a research professor at Georgetown University. So I'm director of the Cyber Smart Research Center of that university, and I'm heading blockchain research here. And I'm also, so my background is cryptography and cryptography protocols like a blockchain or other protocols. And now I'm acting chair of the blockchain governance initiative led by BG2C. Thank you.
Wonderful. Katharina Pistor from Columbia Law School.
Yes, hello everyone. I teach corporate law and finance at Columbia. I've been doing research on, if you will, the legal coding of financial systems and economic systems. Thank you.
Fantastic. Pindar Wong from Verify Limited.
Hi, I'm Pindar Wong, based in Hong Kong. I'm a Bitcoin enthusiast, and I've been involved with some architectural designs on the next generation logistics and trade and settlement systems. Thank you.
And last but not least, Shinichiro Yamazaki from Sumitomo Mitsui.
Thank you, Michael. Hello, everybody. I'm a APAC region head of trade financing on SMBC, as well as I'm the global head of the digital innovation in SMBC, based in Singapore. I'm looking forward to this panel. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I just want to, say a few words up the top just to give some context to what we're going to be talking about here, some framing, if you like. And I was actually struck by something that Pindar had mentioned to us as we were having our group chats before this. And Pindar, you talked about how there's something quite powerful about this moment with regards to COVID-19 and how it makes us think about the systems and the networks of life, if you like, that are so important, but also require new thinking around governance. And you said that living with COVID-19 makes transparent the fact that we all rely on each other, and it teaches us that life is this network, and that essentially we need to cooperate or we die. And I think that's a fascinating way to frame this. I was, it's been this awareness that public health, for example, is now something that we share. That our health is dependent upon the health of others, for example, and that just makes us think about the connectivity of everything. I was also struck by one example of this in Portugal when the Portuguese government were grappling with the fact that COVID-19 was confronting them. They had a host of undocumented immigrants, as many people in Europe do, and they immediately gave them citizenship because they realized that that was the fastest way to onboard them into the healthcare system, because they needed them to be healthy for the sake of the population itself. So it brings about this broader sense of inclusiveness, in a positive sense. But of course, there's huge challenges that have come with this. And then I think, one of the mains is to think of, in some respects, how centralized governance has failed. I'm based in the United States, and I think it's fair to say, it's not really incontrovertible at this stage, that the United States is either the first or the worst or the second worst performing nation in the world with regards to how, the caseload and the deaths and everything else. And it clearly does seem as if the federal system, the federal government itself, has had a real challenge in coordinating responses. Obviously, shortages of medical supplies and everything else are the clearest indication of that. And the solutions have often come from the bottom up. We've seen certain governments, certain states have done well, certain cities have done well. So we're looking at how decentralized responses are actually working. And this feeds into the conversation around blockchain, which of course is looking to discover new forms of governance around a more decentralized architecture. So the failure of centralized systems is a big theme here as well. And I'd also say that related to that is this problem of a lack of resiliency. We built supply chains and systems that were really focused on efficiency, on computational controls, but also business models that give us just-in-time inventory, for example. But when there's a shock as big as this one, we don't have backups. We don't have stores of supplies. We don't have systems that can immediately look to source, whether it is goods or money from alternative sources, and figure out new flexible ways to govern ourselves. I think that's another big theme in this. As I say, it applies both to goods and money. So there's been real problems in how we get goods to where they're needed, particularly medical supplies. But there's also been this big problem in how we deliver money to who gets it. And this old, analog systems we have shown their limitations when people in desperate need of resources have needed it quickly. So these are some of the broad problems that we've seen. The contact tracing challenge, I think, is a really important way to think about this in particular. And we've got a few people who've worked on these systems on the panel who can talk about this in particular. And there, I think we get this real conflict, this important sort of defining conflict between, on the one hand, the public need for information about the health of the system, the well-being of everybody as a collective, that conflicts in many respects with the private rights of the individual. And so there's great concerns in the United States, for example, about the civil liberties that might be lost in a centralized system in terms of how we contact trace everybody and keep track of those records for the benefit of the public. And I think it's one reason why the United States is paying a high cost for this. But on the other hand, how do we protect those civil liberties? Because they are fundamental to everything, to who we are, and to sort of the freedom, if you like, and the freedom of the market. And I just want to put in one last point on this to sort of, I think, frame it as well. Here in the United States, of course, in addition to COVID-19, we've had another big, massive upheaval in relation to the killing, the murder, I would say, of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement that has sprung up around that. And it's very important to me because it talks to the challenge of inclusion. This is a battle against exclusion, and if we're talking about a governance system that is for the benefit of everybody, if we're looking to design technologies and algorithms and systems that can address these new challenges in a decentralized way, how do we ensure that everybody is included in that process is absolutely fundamental. We don't want algorithms to be designed purely for the interests of one narrow group. There needs to be collective inclusion. And it's been pointed out in some of the conversations we had before this, but there are companies and businesses that are also excluded from some of these processes, and how do we include them? But I think at the start of this, we really need to focus on the critical place of the human being in the center of all this. And I think, Pindar, if I can throw to you first on this, you've done a lot of work in the realm of identity, and identity is an important component of this challenge, because we are, grappling with the notion of how do people participate, share information with each other in a way that doesn't necessarily impede upon the giving up that critical data about who we are. So, maybe you can talk to give us a bit of a framing on why that particular question matters in this particular case.
Sure. So thank you, Michael, for the excellent framing. I've been dealing with online identity in different forms for over 20 years now. And I think it's very important to realize that as human beings, I feel, therefore I am, right? So although I have a name, Pindar Wong, I have all these other labels, my telephone number, my IP address, I am who I am. And so we have to separate two things, one of which is identity is a very complicated topic, but identifiers, or how I identify myself in a network in particular, is relatively well understood. For example, domain names is what we've been wrestling with for over 20 years. The phone network has a phone number. In this case, however, something slightly different, which is we're realizing that this disease sees no borders, very much like the internet. The disease is non-discriminatory insofar as it affects humans equally, although there are some economic concerns there. So the real question to me is where the balance of power lies, because we have a fundamental paradox, which is if my health relies on your health, and the health burden is shared by all of us, then in terms of contact tracing, I have to reveal something about me, some identifier about me. And there are a lot of examples of contact tracing apps in Singapore and Europe, in the UK, also now put into our phones by Google and Apple, for example. And that contact tracing, that decision is being such that we can release our information and they can know who we're in contact with. But who does that actual matching? Is it the centralized system that does that, or do I get to choose? Because right now we're dealing with two kinds of governments. One, which is the governments in the country that we're at, and the government inside your phone. So today's conversation is very timely because, in my view, the computation of who decides where I'm linked, that is actually my computation to be provided. And so I'll just leave and close with one example, which is Singapore has developed these devices which do contact tracing, and they were taken apart by a group of hackers. One of them is Bunny Wong from MIT. And what was very interesting is that one of the observations that the device is interesting because it's limited by its battery power. It has a little battery, and so it can't use GPS for very, very long. And so everyone feels okay, whereas obviously we recharge our phones every day. And so the degree of over what duration does one track the information, and who actually does the matching? The assumption right now is that it's governments. The assumption right now is that the governments in collusion or in cooperation with private sector, i.e. public sector cooperating with private sector, makes that decision for us. Well, in the old days, that cooperation was called kind of fascism. In other words, when private sector colludes with governments. So I think right now, because blockchain architectures are decentralized by definition and have a very interesting property, which is they can be both transparent, but also private. So it would be wonderful to explore this evening and today of what are the realms of that, what are the computations and what are the balances of power, literally electrical power and computing power, of who makes those connections. Thank you.
That's great, Pindar. So yeah, that's a kind of a call to action here. Let's dive into this. Joaquin, I know that you've done some work around privacy questions with regards to contact tracing, and that obviously speaks to this issue. And I think you maybe have a slide or two to share with us on your work. Are you able to jump in now?
Yeah, I'm trying to transfer this to see. Can you see it?
Yes, looks good.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm a security guy. Like I said before, have my interest on security, and by security, I also include data privacy management, identity management, etc. So this is basically something that we have done with some colleagues here at IMT. And I will just try to summarize very quickly. I wanted to share more or less how we see the architecture going back to Pindar when we talk about centralized, decentralized. So here I start with the traditional statement, what we have seen in the media, and basically what we talk about privacy is about how utility, in fact, of the threat to privacy is. And in this case, I would assume that by utility, we are talking about medical utility, of course. So what we have usually is that the initial idea is that centralized is bad for privacy. So we have seen right now, Pindar was mentioning, I mean, collusion of the government is a central point of attack, etc. So we have clearly the idea that the privacy can be danger, but at the same time, we have everything in a central point. So the utility in terms of medical utility probably is going to be high, is what we believe. So we have the epidemiology models in a central server. This can be good in terms like, for example, the COVID is changing. So a single point for the model, just a single place to do the updates, etc. So basically high utility when we talk about the centralized model, and low privacy when we talk about centralized model. And more or less the inverse when we talk about the decentralized. Maybe the utility can be somehow affected. Maybe is much more complex to update the models. But the privacy, clearly, the fact that we are decentralizing, we have the perception that is increasing. But actually, let me go back to how it works, the central model, or how we think about these contact tracing applications. What we assume is that we have different users. So I'm going to have a user V and a user U that are basically just exchanging identities. These kind of identities are kind of pseudonyms, ephemeral identities that are somehow changing over time. In the centralized world, in the centralized model, we assume that these kind of identities are provided by a server. The server basically is giving the identities to the users, to user U and to user V. So when they see each other and they compute their relative distance, the server knows exactly if we are close to somebody infected. A user U is going to be also potentially infected. So clearly here we have an exchange of identifiers, but the important thing is that the status about a user being infected stays in a central point, in a server that is centralized. When we move to what we call the centralized model, I have put here that is more semi-decentralized, because most of the applications that are right now for smartphones that we call decentralized, in fact, they also have a central server. And this is because we assume that basically the status of the one that's going to be reported as infected needs to be under the control, for example, of a doctor in medicine. And this is the one that is going to report that somebody infected is going to be given to a central server, and this is going to contact all the other users that have been in proximity with this user in order to create this kind of social graph and who can be infected. So actually, most of the applications that we see that still have utility when we talk about decentralized is because they also have a central server. So the difference between this approach central and this approach decentralized, actually still we have a central point. And this is something that how we can make improvements on this architecture. So the approach discussed by Pindar about using blockchain will be what I call here fully decentralized approach. If we really want to have something fully decentralized, clearly we need to get rid of this central point that at this moment we have in the decentralized applications. We need to be talking about using a kind of peer-to-peer network like we have in blockchain applications. And the bad side is that the user that is trying to get total control about the identities and the status of being or not being infected is going to be having a kind of big database that somehow substitutes the central server. So when we go to the summary of is decentralized or the decentralized model one better than the other, and we do this analysis in terms of utility and privacy, I think we need to make sure that we are talking about a fully decentralized model that I think that the utility maybe can increase if we have total control to the user about the information about the status of people infected, or we are talking about this semi-decentralized approach in which most likely does not have the advantages that we expect from this.
Joaquin, that's great. Thank you. I think one of the interesting aspects of all of this is that the utility, the medical utility, is now something that's essentially measured as a collective, right? And so that I think in some respects I find epidemiology fascinating because it's not really a study of medicine at all. It's really a study about social behavior. And so designing something that is going to maximize for social outcomes, that our behaviors are going to be optimized, I think is really what the ultimate goal is. So I think that's kind of one of the underlying underpinnings, I think, of where we end up in that conclusion there. Tatsuya, you've actually worked though, I think, on developing a contact tracing app. Maybe you'd like to weigh in here and give your thoughts from a sort of a practical experience on how we design for